So, yes, thank you. She's good at that. So while we're waiting for Jeremiah to pull up the slide deck, on everybody's table, there is a single sheet of paper that has, I think I've already explained this to basically everyone, has the topics that we're going to go over tonight, or that we can go over tonight. So put a check next to the one that most interests you, and everybody gets put 2 or 3 checks on there, and because we won't have time to get through all of these, so we're going to kind of pick the ones that are most interesting to people. Okay? All right, you ready, Jeremiah? All right, well, thanks for coming. My name is Chad Goss. This is, I think, I know everybody here. My home church, obviously here. I've been doing this every quarter for the last 2.5 years, I think. The last 2 have been basically this type of setup, where we just kind of dealt with common objections. So the idea here is for people to give everyone kind of a top-level understanding of a particular topic, but more than anything else, I really want people to ask questions, right? Because I don't like to talk incessantly, but I do like to answer questions. Hold on. It's on. Okay. So the got it? So this slide got kind of weird, which is fine because this is the slide that's in the middle of your table. Can you okay. Yeah, just go click. Yeah. All right, so what is it and why do we engage in it? Click. Good job. What is apologetics? So since maybe some people haven't been here before, I'm going to go through the first 4 or 5 slides really fast. It does not mean to apologize. It's a Greek word. It means to provide a defense. So what we're doing with apologetics is we're speaking in defense of the Christian truth claim. There are basically 2 types of branches, offensive and defensive. Offensive apologetics is reasons to believe. They are arguments from natural theology. Christian evidences, like evidence for the resurrection. The second section is defensive. It deals with the objections to Christianity. Like, what are the objections to God's existence? Like, if he exists, why is there so much evil in the world? That kind of thing. Next. There we go. Why do it? I think there's 2 reasons. For the believer, especially for those people under the age of 20, in that range, right? As they're going out into the world, for the first time, they're kind of faced with these questions that perhaps they've never encountered before. And this is really important to realize that there are outstanding answers to every question that's asked. We're going to get to it in a little bit, but what you're going to see is that God nowhere commands us to believe something in spite of all evidence to the contrary. Our faith is a reasonable faith. It's very useful. Now, that's not to say, and this is another important point, that's not to say that God needs to be proved to be true. He just exists. He doesn't need any of this. And yet, it's a very helpful tool. If Christianity is seen as being intellectually viable, it just lowers that boundary a little bit to hearing it. Next. So my wife's favorite television show, or movie rather, Miracle on 34th Street, is a quote from there. Faith is believing something when common sense tells you not to. That is false. That is absolutely false. Not true. Next. Okay. Before we start, approach. So remember, first off, when you're talking with people, the truth of Christianity doesn't rest on your ability to construct a winning argument. If you don't know, you don't know. That's fine. It's not like you lose, right? And I hope someone asks me a question tonight, Nathan, that I can't answer. That would be great, because then I could say, you could watch, and I'll say, I don't know. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with saying you don't know. Do some research and come back. What I will guarantee, I'll guarantee two things. You're not going to know the answer to every question that's asked, but I will guarantee that that question's been asked and answered for hundreds of years. And that answer has been scrutinized intellectually and is solid. So it exists, you just got to go out there and find it. In terms of methodology, when you're engaging with unbelievers on these kind of things, make sure you understand first what they're saying. And I will ask them a question. I'll just keep asking questions until I can see in their eyes that they're satisfied that I understand what they're asking. That's really important, because if you do that, they're going to interrupt you a lot less when you provide the answer, right? Ideas compete, not people. That's super important. About the best you can do, in all the discussions I've had with atheists, never once have I had the atheist go, wow, you've defeated me with logic. I am now a Christian. It's not going to happen, right? But what you do is you'll kind of lower that bar just a little bit, right? You'll say, oh, well, okay, this person had some okay answers. I don't believe them, but they had some good answers. Next. Guardrails. So when you're discussing with unbelievers, especially in today's culture, is it okay, for example, if someone comes up to you and says, I can't believe in a religion that requires me to believe that the universe is only 10,000 years old? What if someone says that to you? Now, is it okay to say, no problem? There's differing views, Christian views on this. There's a young earth and an old earth. Both has biblical support. It's not a problem. Next. How about this? How about if someone says, I can't believe in Christianity if it's a religion that's going to send someone to hell? And I said, no problem. There's different Christian views. Some people view all Christians as going to heaven. Every single human goes to heaven. Universalism. Everyone goes to heaven. Is there anything wrong with that? It's not true. So what's the difference between these two? It's fine to say there's two different views on the age of the universe, but it's not fine to say there's two different views on whether judgment exists and heaven and hell exist. Exactly. Next. Exactly what Ethan said. We can agree to disagree on non-essentials. We cannot agree to disagree on essentials. Right? Next. So what are some examples of essential Christian doctrines? There's a partial list. Right? I'm not going to read the whole thing. But like Ethan said, it's grounded in Scripture. Next. Next. I'm not going to go through the creeds. Next. So we are presenting, or we are addressing objections to Christian truth claims within the bounds of Christian orthodoxy. That's not the Orthodox Church. It's Christian orthodoxy. It means right belief. We are not trying to make Christianity more palatable by reducing or eliminating any objection. We're not going to do that. That's really important. Next. There. Oh, next. Okay. So now we're at the outline. Let me pick Ethan's table. Which one was the highest on your hit list?
First one. Why does God allow suffering?
All right, let's go next and next. So this is known in Christian philosophical circles as the problem of evil. It's absolutely always number one on the hit list. Always. If you talk to an atheist, that's the first thing they're going to ask. And it's simple to understand. Why would God allow all this evil if he could do something about it? Isn't all this evil more consistent with our universe being unguided, uncreated, unplanned, right? This time I did something different. Instead of waiting till the end to provide kind of a summary, I put the summary at the top. So when we're going through the backup for the summary, you'll see what the summary is. The summary is, God has morally sufficient reasons for this evil to exist. Now, this applies both to moral and natural evil. All of these things we'll get to, but so that you kind of know what I'm heading towards, this is it. Second, the Christian faith does not deny that evil exists. Rather, it explains why it does. Next slide. Any questions on that? Nothing. Okay, next slide. Next slide. There you go. Okay, so lest you think that this was a recently invented problem, Epicurus articulated kind of the classic formulation of this argument in 300 BC. It was a long time ago. Very simple. An all-powerful God has the ability to prevent evil. Number two, a perfectly good God would want to prevent all evil. Number three, if God is good and all-powerful, why does evil exist? So, put your thinking hats on once, just for a minute. Of the first two, which one looks a little suspicious? Like there might be a problem with that statement. Why?
Because it said he would not want, like you say, like what we would want, what he would not want to prevent,
All evil. Exactly correct. Next. The key question is, would a perfectly good God want to prevent all evil? All evil. That's the crucial part. Just keep that in your mind for the moment. Would a perfectly good God want to prevent all evil? How many parents in the room? In the course of your parenting, have you used adverse circumstances in your children's lives to teach them a lesson? Everyone here has a parent. During the course of your childhood, did your parents use adverse circumstances as a good thing? How many, well, it's probably the older people. How many people were spanked when they were a kid, right? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Now, granted, they're not all for good reasons. However, at least some were, right? At least some of these instances were for good reason, right? Yes. Yes. And if you go back, can you go back a slide, Jeremiah? Oh, I'm sorry. Go to the next one. It's at the top of that one. A perfectly good God would want to prevent all evil. Every word in that's directly out of William Lane Craig's stuff. And before I go, basically everything in this slide deck is a ripoff from William Lane Craig. And this is directly out of his. I tried to put his name where I had quoted him, but I didn't there. William Lane Craig is a Christian philosopher. If you haven't heard that name and this topic interests you, get familiar with it. He's the man. He is the Tom Brady of apologetics. So He's dominated. He's had 60 or so debates over the last 30 years. And by every account, even atheists' accounts, he's won every single one. He is completely undefeated, if you haven't heard them. And he's debated cosmologists like Sean Carroll, on the nature of time. Amazing stuff.
The debates on YouTube?
They're all on YouTube.
Yeah.
And if they're not there, they're on reasonablefaith.com.
Okay.
Yes?
I think we can all agree that Lucifer is the source of all the evil in the world. How was, assuming God created the entire universe perfect, how was evil able to originate out of perfect?
So the question, so I have to repeat the question because they can't hear you, which is why I'm doing this. So the question is, if we assume that Luther was the origin of all evil that exists, how is it that evil managed to percolate through everything? Why didn't it just get stopped at that point? Is it true that a perfectly good God would want to prevent all evil? And we're going to get to that in just a minute. Next question. So, actually, before I go on to the next one, philosophers break this question down into two parts. I won't go into the nuances of it. The point is, we can think of it as being kind of two levels. Everyone you'll ever talk to in the world can accept that some level of evil is consistent with the existence of God. Some, right? No one's going to say, well, none, right? Because many times things that appear evil in a moment actually turn out to be good. And you talk to 1 billion people, they're going to say, oh, yeah, okay, fine. I'll grant you that some level of evil is consistent with the existence of God. But there's so much. And here's the key part. There's so much unnecessary evil. That's the piece, the unnecessary piece. Is there unnecessary evil? And it pertains directly to that question, which we'll get to next. Oh, here it is. So does gratuitous, a fancy word gratuitous, unnecessary evil exist? Does God have morally sufficient reasons to allow all this evil? Why didn't he wax Lucifer the instant he fell? Why didn't he do that? That's the key question. Does God have a morally sufficient reason for that contingent being? He doesn't have to exist. A contingent, we're all contingent, meaning we don't have to exist. If God doesn't want me to exist, what's going to happen? I will cease to exist just like that. We're contingent. So is he under some obligation to allow this thing to continue? Is he under some obligation? Did he make a deal with Satan that says, okay, yeah, well, go ahead and do your thing. There's nothing I can do. Go ahead. Is that what we're saying? We're going to answer that question next. So Craig says, is there perhaps a reason why God permits all this evil in the world? Perhaps it somehow fits into the grand scheme of things, which we can only dimly discern. How do we know? That's, if you keep one thing in your mind, and a lot of people say, oh, you're just appealing to God acts in mysterious ways. Yes, I am. That's exactly what I'm doing. We don't understand. His understanding is infinitely larger than mine. When I put my dog in the room and close the door, because we're leaving, and I don't want him to jump on the couch, the dog looks at me like, what are you doing? Does the dog understand? Does he have any ability to understand? Does he have that ability to understand? Does it come into, he's like, oh, I know what he's doing. he's putting me in here so I won't jump on the couch because he doesn't want to like vacuum the couch. He doesn't want stains on the couch. The dog doesn't have the capacity to reason like that. Now here's the thing. You and I, in relation to God, we're a billion times less intellectually able to understand what he's doing. If you just consider that for an instant, we don't think of ourselves as being terribly intellectually limited. I mean, granted, there's a billion smarter people than me, but you're like, well, you know, I'm not my dog. I mean, I'm smarter than my dog, you know? But actually, in the grand scheme of things, there's my dog, me, and then God is like way up there. So I'm like, in God's eyes, I'm like, just like fractionally smarter than my dog. Next, how do we know? Here's some fancy definitions for people that are interested in the topic. The two important ones are the types of evil. There's natural evil and there's moral evil. This is important. This is an important thing to grasp. Moral evil is the evil that people do. Now you could say, well, people are evil because they're fallen and they do evil things. Well, how do you explain disease? How do you explain earthquakes? How do you explain famines, right? All of these things. How do you explain that type of evil? Next. So when you're in this, I think the first thing you want to do is you want to acknowledge the seeming contradiction or the paradox of an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good God and the reality of natural and moral evil. You don't want to minimize the moral and natural evil we see around us. You just don't. Don't do it, because it's impossible too. Oh, okay. So you don't want to minimize it. You want to acknowledge it, and you want to say, I agree. It's a stumper. But I have some thoughts. Number two, you come to a common agreement that there's actually many examples where things that are evil in a moment actually turn out to be good. Now, you can give them Joseph. There's many biblical examples, but you don't have to go far. Everyone in their own lives is going to have an example. You got to remember, the question is, so that person is going to say, okay, sure. There are many times when I thought something was evil and it turned out ultimately it wasn't evil. So it actually wasn't evil. Right? I thought it was, but it turned out not to be. They're going to agree to that. However, the question always comes down to, what about some poor 12-year-old kid kidnapped and sold into slavery? What possible good could come from that? It's so easy to prevent. What possible good could come from that? Next. So I think there's a couple of helpful things. From the Christian perspective, we want to note that the universe has not always been in this present fallen state. It wasn't created this way. That's the Christian view. Now, they can accept it or not accept it, but that's the Christian view. On the Christian view, here's the second point that's really important. The purpose of this reality, of this universe, is salvation. It's not happiness. If the purpose is happiness, clearly bad job review for God. Poor job. But that's not the purpose. The purpose is salvation. God will use these events to achieve that. That's the goal, to maximize the number of people who spend eternity with him. That's the goal. If that requires pain and suffering, that's what's going to happen. Because ultimately, that's what it achieves, a good thing. So you want to review evil in the moment versus ultimate evil in our inability to know these things, right? Who saw Ashton Kutcher was in a great movie, Butterfly Effect. You ever see that movie? Anybody? It's a great movie. It talks about, he goes back to fix this one. He goes back in time to fix this one little thing. He fixes that, but that creates all these other problems. So he goes back to fix that, he creates these other problems. He goes back to fix that, creates these other problems. And it's just, it's horrible. He ends up like destroying everything. John. He uses evil to maximize the number of saved persons. Correct. Would we all be saved if evil didn't exist? That is a good question. Without getting too deep into it, that kind of talks about the fall, the reasons for the fall, the William Lane Craig answer is going to be, God has actualized a world wherein the most persons that can be saved will be saved. That's the world we live in, and in that world, the fall occurred. Right. That's his answer, but without kind of getting into the weeds. But yes, that's a good question. So, review the inability of knowing the ultimate outcome of a particular event. That should be easy. Suggest that God always has morally sufficient reasons for these evils to exist. Remember, it's the gratuitous evil part, right? That's the key. The key is people can accept some. Jeff?
In a situation sometimes that people put themselves in the evil situation.
Sure. I mean, any carpenters in the room? You ever hit your hand with a hammer? Whose fault is that? Right? It's mine. Sure. So yes. Yeah, if you fall asleep at the wheel and that's your. But here's the thing. You still don't dodge the fact that when I'm swinging, God could have put a gust of wind. He could have prevented it, right? When you're falling asleep at the wheel, he could have just had you gently veer off and onto the median and, into some bushes and roll to a stop and no problem, no harm, no foul. That's what you're up against, right? There's always a way, in anything you can think of, there's always going to be a comeback of how God could have reduced the evil in that situation. Questions? That was a good question. Okay, next. And here's where we get to next. Here's where we get to Ethan's original question. Avoid these explanations. And by explanation, I mean, here's the reason why purposeless, gratuitous evil exists. Ultimate, purposeless evil. It has no reason. We could have gotten rid of this piece of evil and not reduced the number of saved people. It was gratuitous. It was not needed, unnecessary. God wishes he could stop, but there's just nothing he can do about it. Right? I've heard people say, well, the title deed for the earth was given to Satan. Satan gets to do whatever he wants, and God's hands are basically tied. I want to jump up and down when I hear people say that because I don't know what are the characteristics of this God you're talking about. The God I serve is omnipotent, all-powerful, right? All-knowing, all good. That's gods whose hands are tied and can't do something. That doesn't sound right. What would happen if God didn't want Satan to exist? Would he exist? He would not. Now, a good example from a biblical perspective is Judas. Now, did what Judas do, was it evil? Without a doubt. What's the most evil act in all of human history? The most unfair thing that has ever happened in the history of the world. Crucifixion. That's when a perfectly innocent person was put to death for crimes that he didn't commit. Right? There's never, in the history of the world, there's never been anything so unjust. Now, what part did Judas play in this? He's the one that gave him up. And in Peter's speech, it talks about how he was foreordained to do that. Now, could God have dropped the tree on Judas at birth and gotten rid of Judas and thereby avoided the entire crucifixion? Of course. But that's not what he wanted. That's not his plan. Christ had to die for us. Now, what Judas, don't get me wrong, what Judas did is not good. Judas not in heaven right now saying, well, I thought it actually turned out pretty good, so why don't you let me in? That's not what's happening. And yet, his evil act was, I'll say used, for lack of a better term, for a good. That the most evil thing in history actually had the most ultimate good. So that's kind of why Satan exists, in my view, is that even though he is evil, and the things that he does are evil, and he will justly be condemned, and yet it accomplishes good in some way, shape, or form. Very, very similar to where Judas. I mean, it says Satan entered Judas's heart, right? That's a good example, I think. Any questions on that? Next slide. So here is Craig's argument. Yes? Absolutely. It's crucial to R.C. Sproul, who I listen to a lot. He says, at this point in his presentation on this, he'll stop and say, now I want you to understand, it's a sin to call evil good. It is, and I don't want to commit that sin. It's a sin to call evil good, and I'm not saying evil is good, right? That's never what we want to say. Evil is not good. Evil is evil, justly condemned. It's a sin to call evil good. It's also a sin to call good evil. But, he always says it like that, but it is good that evil exists. Otherwise, it wouldn't. It's hard to argue with that. What's that? Otherwise, it wouldn't. So when I say that, what I'm saying is that when I talk to people, if I say something like, well, do you agree that some things that seem evil can actually turn out to be good? So some evil is actually, it's not inconsistent. Some things being evil is not inconsistent with the existence of God. Simply because we don't have the ability to understand the ultimate outcome, which can actually be good. It seems evil, but it can actually be good. So that's what I mean by that. Does that answer it?
No, but that's okay. I guess I'm just, I believe it's something that I get over in my personal life.
Yeah.
Because I am a Christian, but I can see how someone would say, I don't believe because of this.
Right.
And I get to find the answer that I can.
Right.
I guess I get to be able to have a response to that is other than what the Bible says.
Right. So I will be perfectly honest with you. I will be perfectly honest with you. And there's been many times, and I've been looking at this for 20 years, and there's been many times I'm like, look, God, this situation is unnecessarily evil. I see no good coming out of this. I don't understand why you're not fixing it. Even though I believe this with my whole heart. Still, I pray that way because I just don't. I just don't see how there's any good going to come out of this. I just don't. So that's how I pray. Now, with that in mind, it's a slide after this. But hold that thought. So it's a slide after this that I kind of deal with exactly with that. Yes?
Would you ever use free will?
Right. Right. So, yeah. So so certainly, so free will. God created creatures with free will. To have free will means to have a choice, which means to be able to pick between good and evil. So no one denies that that those choices in the garden had consequences for all of us, right? But if you just stop there, it's odd, because then you're like, well, yeah, okay, but why can't God heal my child? Is it really because Adam ate the apple? There's simply nothing God can do about this? You know? So it gets, so evil comes into the world. Yes, without a doubt, evil enters the world that way. And yet, God uses these to achieve salvation. Yes, John. Right. So the question is, you know, for each particular evil instance, God does want to do something about it, and he actually is. It's part of this unfolding of the salvific story, right? It's creating the nation of Israel, it's delivering the law, it's the cross of Christ, right? It's this ongoing thing. So 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, there's a little girl who contracts polio and dies. You know, she's 8 years old. What do you say? I don't think if I'm her dad and I go to God and I say, why aren't you fixing her? God's going to say, well, I'm going to get to that, right? I'm going to get to that eventually. No, I'm not going to fix this. There's nothing I can do, but I'm going to get to that. That's the difficulty. If we think that it's purposeless, if that little girl's polio has a purpose, then you're like, oh, okay. Now, I may not understand it, but if it has a purpose, okay, I get it. That's fine. I don't like it, but if it has a purpose. Here's Craig's argument. It's really good. We'll just go through it quick. I think the important one is on the next slide. Now, I'm kind of sensing that the answer, hopefully that appeals to people. It's on the next slide. Well, there you go. It's kind of late. This is what I use. If God exists, and that's a syllogism, it's the only time I'll use that word here. It's a syllogism. It's a deductive argument in the form of two premises and a conclusion. None of that's relevant. What it means is it's a logical argument, right? Number one, if God exists, gratuitous evil does not exist, right? I've hung my hat on that more times than you could possibly imagine. If God exists, unnecessary evil does not exist. It simply doesn't. And we kind of close our prayers, you know, when we pray for people, we'll say, you know, this is what I desire, and yet your will be done. You know, we always will say that. In fact, that's how Jesus prayed in the garden. I don't want to do this. I really don't want to do this. So much so that the sweat poured off his face so bad that the capillaries broke in his face, and it actually rained down blood. That's how badly he didn't want to go to the cross. And yet, His desire to save us was stronger. So he said, and yet I will, because I know that the glory of the cross awaits me. Go ahead, Jeff.
In our discussion, we talked about, my question is, God doesn't,
Correct.
initially in the Garden of Eden, initially, before the fall, there was evil exist.
Well, the serpent was there. The craftiest of all creatures. Certainly, I don't know how you call the serpent good.
But the basis, to me, is that he made a choice.
Serpent,
Adam made a choice.
exactly. So every contingent being is created with the ability to freely choose. And the Bible talks about that. Satan and there was a group of angels along with Satan who rebelled, and as a result, they fell. That was their choice. Others didn't, right? So likewise with us, some humans rebel and go to their graves rebelling. Other humans don't. Other humans turn to Christ. So again, number one, if God exists, gratuitous evil does not exist. I trust that there's a reason. Even when I cannot understand it, I probably will never understand it, and that's just the way it is. But just hanging on to that, it really means a lot. Number two, God exists. Now, to support that premise, you can bring along all kinds of arguments to prove that God exists and God possesses the characteristics. Perfectly good, all-powerful, all-knowing. Therefore, gratuitous evil does not exist, right? So that's Craig's syllogism to support that conclusion that gratuitous evil does not exist. I think it's ironclad. I've hung my hat on it a million times. There's a really important thing here. If God isn't sovereign over the evil that occurs, it's impossible for him to fulfill the promise of Romans 8:28. Does anyone know what Romans 8:28 is? All things work together for the good, for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. All things, right? That's the promise. If God isn't sovereign, how can he fulfill that promise? He cannot. If he's with his hands tied going, I hope this turns out all right. Right? That's not how he operates. Okay, next slide. For the Christian, when we're in pain and wondering what possible purpose something could have, you can remind yourself that God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good. Remind ourselves that our ability to understand how some terrible event can ultimately good is, in probably most cases, impossible. It's not going to happen. I can look around here, and I know a bunch of you, and I know you're experiencing physical issues that you wish would go away, right? I know that, as am I. It's not, number three, it's not a cop-out for me to trust that God has a purpose in allowing evil to exist, even when it seems to me purposeless. That's a really key point. Oh, I had 828 there. There you go. Okay, that's. Let's see if we can do another. Any questions on the problem of evil? Any last questions? Yeah.
So it says, like God created all the creatures.
Mm-hmm.
God said it's all good.
Right.
I looked at it. I'll read it to you. So in chapter 3 of Genesis, it says, now the serpent was more craftier than any beast that did. So if
Is the serpent good?
it's evil, then how is it not classified as good because God said it?
So the question is, God, after his creative activities of the first 6 days, looked down and looked at all he had created and said it was good. He pronounced that it was good. That includes who? The serpent. He's in the garden, right? And this gets to how something can be used for good, right? And I look at this as like akin to Judas, right? Was Judas good? Well, yes and no, sort of, right? Definitely not. The things he did, he's going to hell. He's not going to hell for being good. He's going to hell for being bad. But Peter, in his speech, says that God foreordained this for the good, right? So you really see that these free activities of people, of creatures, of us, actually God uses for good. It's just such a perfect example. Judas is the example I always use, but the serpent's another good example. So, yes, John. Correct. Mm-hmm. Well, the timing is, we don't know the timing of the fall of Satan's legion, right? We don't know when that happened, but right. But yeah, so just so everyone understands, I'm not saying anything Judas ever did was good. That's a guarantee. Everything he did was bad. And yet, God is able to kind of make lemons out of lemonade, right? Lemonade out of lemons. Got that backwards. I was good. That's 40 minutes without a mistake. Dave.
I guess just to kind of clarify for myself and maybe for people, is this notion that before God even began, he already had this plan in place that he was going to take his created people and give them the option.
Right.
He gave them the free choice.
Right.
And once they decided,
Right.
wrongly, because obviously he intended for them to not eat the apple, but eat of the tree of life, which they didn't do, and he
Correct.
kept it away from them until the end, because he realizes
Right.
now that they've chose the wrong thing, that was the beginning of the continuation of all this evil, as opposed to, like, that was a result of the fact
Yes.
that they sinned, that created all this evil exposure through all of God's creation.
Correct. So what Dave just said was that, again, evil enters the world as a result of the free will choices. All of which God knew beforehand would happen and allowed to play out. So we never want to say God is presented with a situation that he didn't know was going to happen, and he's like, oh man, how am I going to, I got to make lemonade out of this somehow. Let's do this. That's not how, he knows what's going to happen, the entire sweep. And yet he lets these events play out. And I want to say, and Craig wants to say, that he lets these events play out because they have a salvation purpose. They have a purpose in saving people. So we're not Calvinistic, and we're not going to go down the route of the way they see the world, but as Arminians, that's how we see the world. Okay. Yes, John.
Man has freedom. God gives mankind liberty and freedom. Gives the heavenly beings, angels, and different things gives them freedom. And so Lucifer, Eve falls.
Right.
A lot of other evil that happens afterwards. So that is, God gives us liberty.
Correct.
And because of that, we choose wrongly. He knows we're going to choose wrongly from the beginning. I don't think any of this is a surprise.
Right.
And then the story as it unfolds is he's going to redeem us.
Correct. That's right.
I guess I don't see that. I guess I'm still going through the gratuitous part. That if you're talking to other people on a regular basis, then how do you square gratuitous with anything? And I see that there's our own liberty and our own
Right.
faulty choices, both even the heavenly beings' choices,
Right.
kind of influence all this. That is part of the story, and that's how much God loves us to redeem us.
Correct. Right.
That,
Correct. So again, just to recap, then we got to move on. Sin, evil enters the world through those free will actions, and yet God uses it to achieve a good. That's kind of the summary. Okay, so what did you guys have? What was your, you had evidence for the resurrection. That's a long one. We'll do that one last. I'm looking for like a 10-minute, and then we can aim for that, and then we'll finish up with that last one. What did you guys have? Dennis, what was your,
Let him get his glasses on.
I checked off here, if I can read it here, about what happens to people who've never heard the gospel.
oh, there you go. So let's go to slide 39, if you would, Jeremiah. What happens to those that have never heard the gospel? This is a good one. This will be like a 10-minute. We'll take a break and for 5 or 10 minutes, and we'll come back and we'll finish up with evidence for the resurrection, because that's a long one. This is known as the fate of the unevangelized. That's kind of the fancy term that apologists use. What happens to the Native American that lived 3,000 years ago? I mean, never heard of Israel, never heard of Christ, never heard of any of this stuff. He came and went, and so what happens to him? Is God just going to say, well, did you accept Christ? He's going to say, who? Okay, next slide. It's unfair to punish me for failing to accept the gospel I've never heard of. Now, I did some research on this. I'll go to number 2 first. It's actually really serious consideration. About 30% of the humans alive right now have never heard the gospel. 30%. Almost 1/3 of the human beings alive today have never heard. If you said, do you know have you met Jesus? They're going to say, who? No. So it's a serious concern. Even more so, I figured out one time that if you calculate all of the people in human history, only about 20% have been exposed to the gospel. The rest have not. Just because so many lived, even before Christ showed up. Now, take that with number 1, the Bible declares that general revelation is sufficient to remove that excuse. What is general revelation? General revelation is a revelation of God in nature. Romans 1:20 says that which can be known about God can be seen from the creation. So Romans 1:20 says that if you look around in the world, you can tell that there's a creator, number 1. And number 2, you know his attributes. You know his moral perfection. And number 3, you know there's a problem. You know that he's morally perfect and you're not. So this general revelation, you don't need the Bible for any of that. Romans 1:20 tells us that God's revelation in nature is sufficient to create in a person a need, an understanding of the need. Next slide. There's a couple really important concepts here. Number 1 is original sin. Original sin doesn't mean the first sin. What it's talking about is the impact that the first sin has on every human. It's cascading through history. That's what that's talking about. And what it means is everyone is guilty. As a result of that, every subsequent human stands condemned. So that guy that lived in North Dakota 3,000 years ago, guilty, okay? And knows it by general revelation. The second point here that's really important is this concept of vincible versus invincible ignorance. Vincible ignorance is an ignorance which can and must be overcome. Invincible ignorance is an ignorance which cannot be overcome. So that Indian that lived 3,000 years ago, was he vincibly ignorant or invincibly ignorant? Vincibly, because it could be overcome. What about a baby that dies at a week old? Invincibly, there's no way. Invincibly ignorant, right? There's absolutely no way that that baby who dies at a week old could ever possibly have apprehended or understood who God was, the nature of this reality, their moral imperfection. That's impossible, right? So is a baby judged? Well, no, it doesn't make any sense. That wouldn't be just. Next slide. Any question on that? So, what we know, original sin, all are guilty. No one, there are some exceptions, right? Mentally incapacitated, infants, that kind of thing, right? That simply cannot. No one is invincibly ignorant due to that general revelation. We also, 1, 2, 3, 1, 1, 1. Christ is the only way. There is no other way. There's no other avenue for that Indian 3,000 years ago. Christ is the only avenue for that Indian, right? So, now what? Bit of a dilemma, right? Conclusion, all humanity is in need of the atoning work of Christ. This is an essential Christian doctrine. Next slide. There are a couple different, the Bible doesn't really spend a lot of time, really at all, talking about the Indian that lived 3,000 years ago. What happens to them? As a result, there's 4 or 5 different, there's 4. The fifth is a heresy. The first 4 are legitimate doctrines that pertain to this. The first one says God does not provide salvation to those who fail to hear the gospel and come to faith in Jesus before they die. He doesn't. So that Indian that lived 3,000 years ago, he's out of luck. Number 2, all people are given the opportunity to be saved by sending the gospel to them in some way, missionary, angel, dream, some way. Every person is given this opportunity. This is called universal opportunity before death. Number 3, the unevangelized may be saved if they respond in faith to God based on the revelation they have. Now I'll give you, that's the one I favor. However, again, the first 4 are legitimate. You can decide which one you choose. But number 3 is the one I believe is the best. Number 4, the post-mortem. You've heard post-mortem evangelization, and we'll kind of touch on where that comes from biblically. Yeah, Ethan.
So under number 3, how specific do you have to believe? Like, let's say I'm that 3,000 years ago. Is the Great Spirit adequate enough? Is the fact that I'm imperfect?
Right.
Or do I have to believe Jesus over in Israel?
Right.
You know, like, what am I expecting?
Right. So the question is under number 3, which is this: you have to respond in faith based upon a revelation that you have. Well, wait, like how much do I have to figure out that Jesus is coming and that kind of thing? William and Craig will say you have to know that you are morally in need and basically throw yourself on the foot of the cross when you don't know that there's a cross, right? You're just basically throwing yourself down saying, I'm in need of this. I need you to accomplish it. Please do. The means, the specific means comes, but you're kind of throwing yourself down like that. That's how he would describe it. Number 5 is a heresy, universalism. Everyone is saved. Don't go that route. Next slide. So this, I'll do briefly. Here's kind of an explanation of the first 4. This is the one this is kind of the hardcore. This is a Calvinist view. Augustine, Calvin, Edward Sproul, they're all Calvinists. And of course, that's what a Calvinist would believe. And it may be true, but it doesn't seem right to me. If you don't hear Jesus, then you're out of luck. Next slide. Universal opportunity before death. I think everyone's heard stories of people receiving dreams and that kind of thing, and certainly that's possible. And I'm sure it does happen. So actually, I don't think this is the wrong answer. A couple examples. Philip in the Ethiopian church, God sends an angel to Philip. Nebuchadnezzar has dreams, which Daniel interprets. Peter and Cornelius, right? So Peter receives a dream to go talk to Cornelius. So this is not, there's biblical support for this. Aquinas Arminius and Norman Geisler, who if you've gone to Liberty, certainly you know that name. Any questions on that? Next slide. This is one I personally favor. And when I'm lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. 1 Timothy 4:10. Romans 2:14 through 16 has a really interesting verse. It says, for when the Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law unto themselves. And this is kind of closely reasoned, but what it talks about is their conscience bearing witness and their conflicting thoughts accusing and excusing them, right? So what it tells you is that the light, if you will, of the gospel, the moral need and the solution is actually written on people's hearts, if that makes sense. Yes?
Can't this, kind of what Ethan was saying, is this being too broad? Can't it contradict?
No, because we're only talking, so the question is, if we make it too broad, can it contradict Christ being the only way? And what I'm going to say is that Christ would be efficacious or applying to these people, even though they didn't necessarily know the identity of Christ. So that's how Craig would explain it, I think. So it's not like there's another way. Christ is the only way. It's just a matter of Christ's blood being applied, even though they didn't necessarily say the sinner's prayer, if you will, like I accept Christ, right? They didn't have an idea of this person, Christ. They just knew that by faith that some way was going to come, that God was going to make some way possible. Next slide. This is a postmodern evangelization. It's possible, and it talks about gospel being preached to those who are dead. It's certainly possible, and not something I would hang my hat on. I wouldn't rely on it, and I wouldn't tell other people to rely on it either, because you're kind of putting your eggs in a basket that if it turns out to be wrong, there's no like changing your mind at that point. But that being said, Clement, MacDonald, Hodge, B.B. Warfield, if you've been to Liberty, you probably heard that name, B.B. Warfield. He's a pretty heavy hitter. People know, it's not without its support. Next slide. Universalism is a heresy. I hope I said that enough. And the reason I included this is because progressive theology embraces universalism. And if you're under the age of 30, you are going to encounter big time progressive theology because it's really under a huge resurgence as a result of the social changes because of the LGBTQ agenda. This progressive theology and universalism is really, really taking hold. So that's why I put it in there, so that you'll know, look, don't fall for that. We do not believe that the atonement applies to everyone. The atonement, the shed blood of Christ is made available to everyone, but it's something you have to, by faith, take hold of. If you don't, by faith, take hold of it, it's not applied to you. And that's a really important point. Next slide. So, the fate of the unregenerate, it's a significant issue simply because so many people fall into this category, and the Bible doesn't say a lot about it. God is just. Ultimately, we know the answer will be just. All of the first four are valid proposals, and you can decide which one is most appealing to you. Where they differ, and to answer your question, Lauren, all four are valid and agree that a person is saved only through the atoning work of Christ. There is no other way. Where they differ is whether or not a person must be exposed to and explicitly believe the gospel of Jesus Christ to have that atonement applied to them. Do not try to present universalism as valid. It's not, in my personal views. Questions? Let's take a break. We'll come back at 1:15 and we'll finish. And circle up. So, one thing I want to be really clear on when it comes to the problem of evil is a couple things to remember. One is that evil entered the world through free will actions, through the fall. Number one. Number two, Satan is evil. There is no good in him. Judas is evil. There is no good in him. They are going to be justly condemned. But there's an aspect of lemonade out of lemons, right? That's important to understand. That God uses these things to achieve a good purpose. So I kind of take that away. Okay, so the next thing we're going to cover, and we're going to try to wrap up at like 20, 25 after. This has to do with whether or not Jesus existed, whether or not he was or was resurrected. Now, I'll say at the onset, if someone comes up to you and said, Jesus didn't even exist, you have to understand at this point, you're not dealing with anybody that's really tethered to reality. There is no atheist scholar. There is no atheist scholar, none, zero, that claims that Jesus never existed. So you gotta, if you encounter that person, just direct them to the Wikipedia entry for the Christ myth theory. It's at the very bottom of the page. I just point them to that slide. Arguing with that person is not going to be very fruitful because they're believing something that actually is completely untethered from reality. Even, I don't know if anyone's heard the name Bart Ehrman. The leading atheist in the world will tell you that certainly, without a doubt, Jesus lived. There was a man born in Bethlehem 2,000 years ago, all right? They're going to disagree about whether he was resurrected, about whether he was the Son of God, but they're not going to disagree about that. So if you encounter this person, just point them at the Wikipedia entry. That being said, I'm going to burn through a couple extra biblical, that means outside of the Bible, references to Jesus. First one is Tacitus in AD 116. He talked about how Nero had blamed Christians for the fire that engulfed Rome, and he talked about Christus, Christ, who was the reason this group of people were named Christians, and that's probably the first extra biblical reference to the crucifixion. Josephus was a Jewish historian of the first century. He mentions him twice. He confirms both the crucifixion and the claim. So what you're going to see is we're going to start building these things, right? Certainly, Christ lived. That's easy. Was he crucified? Yes. And we start applying these things. We know he lived and he was crucified. That doesn't mean he was raised from the dead, but it does mean he was crucified. The Talmud is an ancient Jewish text that references Christ. And what it talks about is it kind of mocks Christ. It makes fun of these stories of Jesus' virgin birth. It contests his claim, and they're saying, "Oh, this guy claimed to be Messiah, but he died, so clearly he wasn't." It accuses him of being a blasphemer. So you can draw an enormous amount from that. The fact that that text accuses Christ of making up this story of a virgin birth, well, what does that tell you? The virgin birth story existed back then. If the Talmud said that Christ was rightfully, it was good. It was a good thing he was executed because he was a blasphemer. Blasphemer of what? That means he was claiming to be God. That's what blasphemy means. So the Talmud kind of inadvertently acknowledges that Jesus claimed to be God, that he claimed that the virgin birth was claimed, that he claimed to be Messiah. Some other ones, Maris, Suetonius, Pliny. Jesus is actually in the Quran. I'm sure most people probably know this. Muslims believe Jesus was a prophet. They don't believe he was the son of God. They would believe he was a prophet. So any questions on the historical Jesus? Remember, if you encounter someone that doesn't believe Jesus was a real person, just walk away. You're not going to accomplish anything in that dialogue. Okay, this is for you, Nathan. Here's the positive case, the evidence for the resurrection. And this, again, this is pulled right out of William Lane Craig. This is what On Guard goes through. On Guard is kind of an easy-to-read thing, which if you're at all interested in this, I would really highly recommend it. It's really cheap, paperback. I think you can get it for like $10. And it kind of goes through a bunch of these arguments. It's by William Lane Craig. There's 4 facts surrounding the empty tomb and their implications, and then we'll deal with some of the hypotheses from empty tomb skeptics. So, memorize this slide. There's 4 facts accepted as historically true by the wide majority of scholars. This includes atheists. Okay? Now, you will not see up there, it's not one of the 4 that he was raised from the dead. That's not one of the 4. What is, after his crucifixion, number 1, after his crucifixion, he was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb. These things become really important because we're going to build on them to make the case that he was resurrected. The fact that he was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb becomes really important. On the Sunday after the crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers. Again, that becomes really important. On different occasions and under different circumstances, various people reported seeing a resurrected Christ, alive from the dead. Now, number 3 doesn't say that he was there. It says these people reported it. Now, they could be lying, but we're going to talk about that. How do we know they're not lying? What we do know is that a lot of different people in different situations reported seeing him risen from the dead. Again, these facts are all agreed to. Gary Habermas, somebody asked me about Gary Habermas, but he did a survey of 34 historians, skeptic to liberal. I'm not sure if it's in here, but I have the whole list if you want to see it. Number 4, the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that Jesus was risen from the dead, despite every predisposition against it. Who's a good example of someone that you would never have thought would come around to believe that Christ was raised from the dead? James, his brother, right? We have every evidence that says that his brother disbelieved it, right? He didn't believe him at all. And yet suddenly, he appears, James reports that his brother, his half-brother, appears to him, and suddenly he goes from being skeptic to willing to lay his life down for his half-brother. I mean, how do you explain that? It's based on these 4 facts. That's why I say memorize this. Because it's based on these 4 facts that we're going to build the case that the statement, God resurrected Jesus from the dead, is the best explanation of those 4 facts. Does that make sense? Any questions? Number 1, Buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb. Why is that so important? Any thoughts before we go? Why is that so important? Who was Joseph of Arimathea, by the way? A member of the Jewish Sanhedrin. Who is the Sanhedrin? The ruling authorities, right? It was a theocracy at the time, which means that the religious leaders were also the government, right? We don't have a theocracy. We have a representative, supposedly, democracy. But anyway, at the time, the Sanhedrin ruled. Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Sanhedrin. Who decided to crucify Christ? The Sanhedrin. Joseph of Arimathea was certainly in the room, and whether or not he voted against it or not, we don't know, but he was part of the group that condemned Jesus. So that's number one. He was buried by Joseph. Why in a tomb? Why are we concerned about that? Because that means it's known. Where was he buried? Over there. He was buried over there. Right? So what's the quickest way to prove that someone wasn't buried over there? You go over and look. Is he there? No, he's not there. He wasn't buried here. It's easy. All right. So, buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb. What's the supporting evidence? Why does everyone believe this to be true? It's multiply attested by early independent sources. Now remember, when someone says, oh, well, that's just the Bible. No. We don't treat, in apologetics, we don't treat the Bible as a single document. It's a collection of documents. The Gospels are 4 different documents written at different times by different people. They're compiled, right? But they're different documents. There's the Gospel of Thomas. Is that in the Bible? No. There's many other very early Christian documents that aren't in the Bible, right? And you can look at those as well. But the point is, we don't ask non-believers, in apologetics anyway, we don't ask non-believers to treat the Bible as inspired. Just treat it like any other ancient historical document, right? Anything else. All right, so I touched on bullet 3 there. Because he's in the Sanhedrin, why would Christians invent the story of someone they hated honorably burying him? If you have a hero and you're going to say, well, this person did the right thing and he buried him, are you going to pick as the hero of your story your worst enemy? That makes no sense at all. You just would never do that. Additionally, if Joseph of Arimathea is sitting on the Sanhedrin and this early story is circulating that Joseph of Arimathea buried him, all Joseph of Arimathea has to do is say, no, I didn't. Right? So that's why. No other competing burial story exists. There isn't another story. That's the only story we have. By the way, I'm going to do this real quick. Let's test our timeline knowledge. When was Jesus born? Anybody?
December 25th, 0.
0. All right, 0. I have a 0. When's the start of his ministry? 32 years later. When was he crucified? 3 years later. So now you got about 32, 33 years. All right, so how far from the crucifixion to Galatians, James, Thessalonians? How many years, roughly? Too many. All right, we have a too many. Anybody? Anybody else? 25. We'll use 20. How about Mark, Gospel of Mark? 40 years from the crucifixion to the Gospel of Mark. Okay, we'll quit there. Now, actually, it's much closer than that. He was born in 3 BC, 30 years. Luke says about 30 years, so we don't completely know. But here's the point. 14 years from the crucifixion in 30 AD to Galatians, James, and Thessalonians. 14 years. That's a really short period of time. John was right. Was it John? Who said 25? 25. It was 24 years from the crucifixion to Mark. So I think someone said 40. I forget. But 24 years. So it's really short. And the older you get, the more you... Is 24 years a long time? Not really, right? So these events... They happened about 30 AD, and they were written down between 14 and 24 years later. A really short period of time. Certainly the people who were alive when he was crucified are still alive, or many, are still alive when these accounts start circulating, right? These claims start getting made. That becomes really important. So, why? Number one, the location of his burial site was known. The empty tomb claim is at the core of Christianity. It could easily have been disproved. The quickest way to debunk an empty tomb claim is simply to point to an occupied one. That's easy. You just go, look, there's the bones. He's still there, right? That's why it's so important. Number one, the number one fact. Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb. If the burial by Joseph was fictitious, we would expect to find something else going on. What happened to the corpse? And we would expect Jewish leadership of the time to easily debunk this. Instead, what did they do? They accused the disciples of stealing the body. That's what happened initially. So what does that prove? The tomb was empty. They accused the disciples of stealing the body, so how do we know they didn't? We'll deal with that later. But that's the whole point. Does that make sense? This is fact number 2. Fact number 2. On the Sunday after the crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers. Why is this important? Was it you, the women followers? Who said their favorite thing was the women followers? I was talking to someone earlier. Why is that so important?
From what I know, women like bottom of the barrel at that time, but they were bottom of the barrel.
Bottom of the barrel. What?
I think it was never taken true.
Unreliable. That's, yeah, you can't look at this claim with 20th century eyes, right? You have to look at it with first century eyes. With first century eyes, women were considered completely unreliable. Their testimony was not admissible in court, right? They were property, essentially. Why would they invent that story, right? Let me ask you a question. If you're going to invent a story about seeing a UFO, who are you going to invent as your witness? I'll give you 2 choices. So you're going to invent a story about seeing a UFO. And you got 2 choices. One is Nathan. He's a college kid. Number 2 is a 20-year veteran of the U.S. Air Force, Top Gun pilot, top secret, everything. Who are you going to say saw this UFO? Well, other than you. Why are you picking the Top Gun pilot? Credibility. Credibility. That's the whole idea. You pick someone who has credibility. Did women have credibility? No. They would never have picked them for that reason. Again, the empty tomb is attested by multiple independent sources. I love the reaction. When they run up to the tomb, what do they say? They come screeching to a stop, and they say, what? I knew he was resurrected. I told you guys, I knew it. Is that what they said? No, they didn't say that at all. They said, where's the body? What happened? Where is it? They didn't know. They didn't know at all. They were very confused. They ran back. The women ran back and got Peter. And then what happens? Peter and John go run into the tomb. Who wins the foot race? He brags about it, right? He runs and he looks inside. And what did he say? I knew it. I told you, Peter. I told you he was resurrected. Was that his reaction? No. They're like, what happened? They're confused. They have no idea what happened to the body. The earliest allegation that the disciples had stolen Jesus' body shows that the body was in fact missing from the tomb. They would never accuse them of stealing the body if the body was still there. And I think we hit the fourth bullet. Any questions on that? Number 3. Different occasions and under various circumstances, different individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive from the dead. Now, am I saying that they saw Jesus alive from the dead? That's not what I'm saying. Because again, atheists agree with this statement. Atheist historians agree with this statement. And they're not going to agree that they saw Jesus resurrected. It's appearances. How do you explain this? How do you explain the fact that these different people in different situations, like groups of 10 different groups of people in different situations, some of whom, like James, didn't believe that Christ was the Messiah, right? How do you explain the fact that all of these different people had this appearance? Is it like hallucinations? Right? Now, people hallucinate stuff all the time, but 10 different groups of people in 10 different situations, right, don't have the same hallucination. That would be, something that we've never seen before. So here's the thing. Mary appeared to Mary at the tomb. 3 women appeared to Peter, to the 2 disciples on the Emmaus Road, the disciples, once with and then once without Thomas, or once without and then once with, James, and a group of more than 500 people, and then Saul. So that's 8 or 9 different situations. By the way, did Saul believe? Was Saul predisposed to belief that Christ was actually the Messiah and was actually risen from the dead? No, why? In fact, he was trying to hunt them down. He was trying to hunt Christians down and kill them because he thought they were heretics. So how do you explain this? How do you explain the fact that these different people in different situations suddenly come to this belief? Like in the course of 40 days, or a very, very short period of time. We have good evidence from the Gospels that neither James nor any of Jesus' younger brothers believed in him during his lifetime. And there's no reason to think that the early church would invent this story of disbelief on their part, right? That doesn't make any sense because it makes them look bad. For example, do you think the story about Peter's denying Christ 3 times was invented? It was invented by early Christians? Probably not, but why? Other than the fact that it's in the Bible and we know the Bible's reliable, what is it about that just, there's no way they would invent something like that? It's simple. It makes him look terrible. He denied the Messiah 3 times. And every human being in history from that point forward knows it. It's like the most embarrassing failure you've ever had in your entire life is written down in a book that gets the widest circulation of any book in all of human history. There's no way. There's no way that they would invent a story like that. So how do we explain it? Mass hallucination? Legendary embellishment? Mass hallucination doesn't work. I mean, how do you, that's never ever happened before. Lots of people have, like Lourdes. You've seen the well at Lourdes in France, right? You'll see the Virgin Mary, groups of people will say they saw visions of things. But the same vision isn't experienced across all of these different things, right? And not only that, but these people that experience visions at Lourdes, if you put them on the rack, I wonder how long they would maintain that they had actually seen this thing, right? When the rubber hits the road and you're on the rack, you're only going to say something, you're going to maintain it if it's actually true. Number 4. They came to believe that he was risen from the dead despite having every predisposition to the contrary. And I think so here's the situation. Crucial to understand how events unfold following the resurrection. Was it the case that the early church said, I knew he was resurrected, I knew it, and they went out and boldly preached the gospel? No, in fact, immediately afterwards, they left. They left Jerusalem. In fact, the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus, when Jesus met them, he said, hey, where are you guys going? He said, well, haven't you heard? We thought Jesus was the Messiah, but he was crucified. So what does that mean? Can a Messiah get crucified in that first century Jewish thinking? The answer is, of course not. If the Messiah is crucified, what does that prove? Not the Messiah. Was Jesus the first century Jew to ever claim to be the Messiah? Is he the only one? No. When I first heard that, it really bothered me. I was like, oh man, really? He wasn't the only one? But then I thought, oh, wow. In all those other cases where someone gained a following, but then they were crucified, what happened to the following? Dispersed, gone. Why? It proves the crucifixion, the death at the hands of the Roman authorities proves he wasn't the Messiah. So of course they're going to stop believing him. Yeah, that's number 2. According to the Jewish law, the execution as a criminal proves him to be a heretic. Number 3 is, let me just move past that. So the sudden and dramatic change demands an explanation. Gerd Ludemann is, along with Bart Ehrman, in the top 10 of atheist historians attempting to prove that Christ isn't the Messiah. I mean, that's all he does, right? But even he says it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and his disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Now, appearances, he's not saying he appeared to them, he's saying they had appearances. But then you have to, well, how do you explain that? Here's a really important one. What did maintaining this belief cost them? Now, do people die for lies? Sure. The guys that flew the planes into the World Trade Center, did they believe a lie? Sure. And were they willing to die for it? Yeah, absolutely. So how is it different from the early Christians? Because we say, they had this belief and they believed it so they held this belief to be so true that they were willing to die for it. And they say, well, guys flew planes into the World Trade Center. They had a belief. They were willing to die for that belief. What's the difference? Anybody?
The belief I would say is the same. It's just whether or not they
Well, so you got to look at what they believe. The guys flew the planes into the World Trade Center because they felt that if they did, there's a reward. There's an instant reward. I forget what this is called, but they get an immediate golden ticket to heaven, and they're in, right? And they read that, and they read that, and they believed it. What did the disciples believe? They believed they'd met Christ. So they didn't believe something written in a book. They believed they'd actually met him. Now, what the guys that flew the plane into the World Trade Center could be a lie. They believed it to be true. However, there's no way they believed that they had met Christ. If I believe I've met you, how can that be disproved, right? You can't unbelieve that kind of thing. That's why that piece is so important. Does that make sense? That's the difference. Where am I? So, conclusions. Joseph of Arimathea buried Jesus in a tomb, later found empty. Those are the 4 facts. All of the natural, non-supernatural explanations, we're going to take a look at one quick one. The best explanation is that Christ miraculously resurrected him from the dead. Let's pick one, and we'll go through it. Here's 4 or 5. The swoon theory says that Jesus didn't die on the cross. He just kind of like passed out. They put him in a tomb. He came around and walked out. That's the swoon theory. The conspiracy theory says that somebody stole the body. Mass hallucination is aimed only at the resurrection. It doesn't deal at all with the empty tomb. It just looks at the resurrection appearances. Legendary embellishment says the empty tomb claim was invented later on. They went to the wrong tomb. Unknown, identical twin brother. Don't laugh. Bart Ehrman advanced this thesis in a debate with William Lane Craig. So pick one. Someone shout out.
The first one.
The first one. There you go. Swoon theory. So the swoon theory, the premise here is that he did not die on a cross. He merely fell unconscious and was later revived. This actually was pretty popular until it was shut down in the 50s. There's a couple things important here. One, Roman soldiers were really good at killing people. That's what they did for a living. They came to Jesus. What did they not do to Jesus that they did to the other 2? Break his legs. What happens when you're crucified and they break your legs? What happens? You can't hold yourself up anymore, right? And your hands are out, and what happens is you fall down and you asphyxiate. You can't breathe anymore. You asphyxiate, it's faster. You're going to die eventually if you're standing there from exposure and that you're going to shock. But since they wanted to get him down, they went around and broke their legs so that the death would be quicker. When they came to Jesus, they didn't do that. So at least that Roman soldier thought he's not dead. And plus they stabbed him in the side. And what happened when they stabbed him in the side? Blood and water. Where's this blood and water come? There's a spiritual aspect of it, but there's also a physical aspect of it. What happens is when you have a lot of trauma to your body, the fluid collects around your heart. And what happens is emergency room physicians will do that. They'll stick a needle in there and drain that fluid. But that's what happens is you stick a knife in there and it releases that. So what that means is it got into his heart. That knife, that spear penetrated actually into his heart. So if he wasn't, if for somehow they made a mistake, well, certainly that would have killed him. I actually have an article from the Journal of the American Medical Association from 1986 that kind of goes through this whole thing. I wish I had time, but it's pretty exhaustive. And it talks about what he went through and how he couldn't have possibly survived it. That being aside, it's still possible that yes, Roman soldiers were really good at killing people, but they made a mistake. Yes, he was stabbed in the side, and it penetrated his heart, and it released blood and water, but still he survived. Let's just say that that happened. Let's say that somehow he survived all that stuff. Here's what killed the theory in the 50s. A half-dead, well, I missed one. He's got to get past he's got to roll a rock back and get past the guards. But let's say he does that. So this is the thing. A half-dead, staggering, sick man, what is this guy going to look like? Right? Just imagine, he's been flogged. Are you familiar with what flogging is? Everyone seen The Passion of the Christ? It's unimaginably brutal. People come out of that unrecognizable, right? It actually flays the skin off your back right down to the ribs, right? So the shock of it is what kills you. So you've got this, skin's gone, face unrecognizable, covered head to toe in blood, staggering around, side, holes in the hands, and he staggers up to his friends in this room and collapses. Now, what's their reaction going to be? What would your reaction be? Well, they might not recognize it, but let's say they recognize them somehow. Let's say they recognize them. What would your reaction be? Call for a doctor. Exactly. You go get help for this guy, right? He's terribly sick. He's going to die. This man needs a doctor. Would your reaction be, oh, God resurrected you from the dead? No, not at all. You would go get a doctor. It would never enter your mind. You would just think, somehow this guy managed to survive this thing and is staggered back to us for help. That's exactly what shot this. No one really advances. Since the 50s, no one has tried to advance this argument at all for that reason. Questions? Maybe we got one more. Legendary embellishment is we got 5 minutes, is the one that most people try to attack. This is the one, if you listen to a William Lane Craig debate, this is all they're going to talk about, legendary embellishment. The premise here is that disciples never believed that Jesus had been physically resurrected. This belief was developed later on. So if you went back to 35 AD and talked to Peter, he would say, no, he's not resurrected. This was just an idea that was developed in Peter's mind over time that, oh, maybe he was resurrected. He's alive in our hearts. And it just kind of took hold and it escalated and it became that. That's exactly what every debate on this subject goes over. And that's why I went back and I looked at the time frames, right? That's why the time frames are so important. 14 years from the crucifixion to Galatians, Thessalonians, right? It's really short period of time. That, if Peter was starting to maintain this thing and Paul was writing this down in his letters to the various churches he was planting, they're easily debunked, right? Because there's going to be an empty tomb. There's going to be an occupied tomb, right? There's not going to be anybody that makes this claim to have seen him, right? That's the key piece. And yet, like I said, this is exactly what everyone goes after right now. Which is why I'm paying so close attention to the date. That period of time, that elapsed time from 33 to 40 to 50 AD, many of his contemporaries, the people that were alive at the time, would still be alive. And was it the case that that they didn't really care? So think back to the Jewish authorities at the time, and there's a Christian community developing and kind of spreading like wildfire. If you look at the time period between 33 to 50 AD, right, that 17-year time period, it's really spreading like wildfire. Now, as an observant Jew, what's your attitude towards this Christian community? Heretics. need to be weeded out, actually needed to be killed. They are committing heresy. So very antagonistic, right? So every Christian claim is going to come under scrutiny, right? That's the key thing, right? You look at do we really care that Mormons hold beliefs that the angel Moroni gave golden plates to Joseph Smith? Do we really care? Not really, right? Who cares? And even if we did care, how would you disprove it? It's impossible how am I supposed to disprove the fact that this guy supposedly got golden plates and no one else saw it, but he got golden plates? How am I supposed to, I can't disprove that. It's unfalsifiable. Now, A, I don't care. B, I can't falsify it. Was that the situation that they faced? No. A, they really cared. And B, it was falsifiable. The Christian claim, I'm not saying it's false, I'm saying it's falsifiable. I'm saying if it's not true, it's easy to prove it false. That's what that word means. So it's easy to prove it false if in fact it's not true. So the fact that this early Christian community spreading like wildfire amidst this persecution, right? At that time, I mean, the early Christian truth claims about the burial, about the resurrection appearances, right? The appearance of the women, they go unchallenged because the people that had these experiences are still alive and making these claims. Questions on that? All right, we're out of time. Thank you so much. Thank you.